Do you worry about Republic coming and shouting things
Everyone has a right to think what they want.
The atmosphere reportedly changed in an instant.
It has been a very tough time for the royal family.
When an unexpected confrontation involving Prince George turned an ordinary public appearance into a moment of royal tension. According to claims circulating online, Camilla's son was at the center of the clash, leaving George embarrassed and Prince William furious. What happened next allegedly pushed family tensions to a new level, with questions quickly spreading about loyalty, respect, and the boundaries inside the monarchy. But what really happened during that encounter, and why did William reportedly react so strongly? The story begins with one unexpected moment. If you enjoy dramatic royal stories, hidden palace tensions, and the latest royal developments, please subscribe. Prince George humiliated at event. Camilla's son had no intention of backing down. What had started as a polished charity gathering inside one of the royal circuit's most prestigious venues suddenly shifted into something far more dramatic. Guests who had arrived expecting speeches, photographs, and polite conversation found themselves witnessing a confrontation that would soon dominate headlines and spark uncomfortable questions behind palace doors. Standing only a short distance from Prince George, Camilla's son pushed forward through the crowd with growing determination. His voice rose above the soft conversations filling the hall, drawing the attention of guests, reporters, and staff alike. What made the scene especially startling was not simply the disagreement itself, but the accusation that followed. In front of dozens of stunned witnesses, he suggested that important decisions affecting the management of a royal estate had not been made openly. Instead, he implied that powerful figures had been working quietly behind the scenes. Then came the moment that changed everything. Prince William's name was suddenly brought into the dispute. The atmosphere tightened instantly. Conversations stopped. Journalists reached for their notebooks. A disagreement that had appeared to concern internal family matters now seemed to touch the future king himself. Prince George remained composed, refusing to answer publicly, but the tension hanging in the room was impossible to ignore. Even more curious was what happened around them. Positioned perfectly to capture nearly every second of the exchange was a freelance photographer already aiming a long camera lens in their direction. The shutter clicked repeatedly from the earliest moments of the confrontation. For many observers, the timing felt remarkably convenient. If the encounter had truly been unexpected, how had someone been ready to document it almost from the start? Within moments, security personnel stepped in. Following a discreet signal, an officer moved through the gathering and positioned himself between the two sides. Under the astonished gaze of guests, Camilla's son was escorted from the main hall. The entire incident lasted less than 2 minutes, yet its impact stretched far beyond that afternoon. As evening approached, palace officials began reviewing guest records and invitation lists. What they uncovered raised fresh concerns. An unusual last-minute VIP invitation had reportedly opened the door for Camilla's son to attend, bypassing normal procedures. By sunset, a regional director linked through distant family connections had been suspended pending investigation. The deeper officials looked, the clearer one troubling possibility became: this was not merely an unexpected confrontation. Someone had helped make it happen. A royal confrontation seemed to erupt in an instant, yet some observers believed the stage had already been set. Why were cameras ready before the drama unfolded, and what urgent message forced Prince William to abandon an important meeting without hesitation, questions, or concern for the headlines that would soon follow? Let's find out. William rushes into royal crisis. A photographer stood in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Reporters seemed unusually prepared. Notebooks were already open, cameras already focused, and within minutes, whispers of a royal confrontation were racing through palace corridors. To some observers, it felt less like a sudden dispute and more like an event someone had expected to happen. Far away, Prince William was in the middle of an important virtual meeting when an aide quietly entered the room. The message delivered was brief, but its impact was immediate. The meeting ended without explanation. William asked no questions about headlines, public relations, or damage control. Instead, he made a single request. He wanted to see every second of the original footage. As the recordings played inside his private office, a far more troubling picture began to emerge. The confrontation at the Royal Horticultural Hall was only part of the story. William watched carefully, not just the people involved, but everyone surrounding them. Certain reporters appeared perfectly positioned. A freelance photographer seemed ready long before tensions became visible. William replayed several moments repeatedly, searching for details others might have missed. Yet another concern was already weighing heavily on his mind. Months earlier, during preparations connected to the coronation of 2023, subtle changes had reportedly begun attracting attention inside royal circles. Prince George's role was clear and rooted in the future of the monarchy. Camilla's son, however, occupied a very different position. Still, small adjustments kept appearing. Extra access, more visibility, special accommodations. Individually, they seemed insignificant. Together, they suggested something larger. The situation reportedly reached a turning point during a rehearsal. Witnesses claimed Camilla's son suggested that future royal events would place him alongside George in increasingly prominent ways. George chose not to engage and walked away. But moments later, attention shifted to a ceremonial badge reserved for the young prince. When George calmly requested its return, the refusal that followed stunned those nearby. Then came the statement that changed everything. Camilla's son allegedly insisted he had already been given approval to use it. Silence spread across the room. The badge itself was not the real issue. It was the confidence behind the claim. And as William reviewed the footage again and again, one question refused to disappear. Who had convinced so many people that boundaries once considered untouchable no longer existed? An insult directed at Prince George seemed destined to become just another fleeting royal controversy. Yet as the headlines faded, troubling questions began to surface behind palace walls. What made Prince William believe the incident was part of something far deeper and was a hidden insider quietly feeding information from within the royal circle itself? Let's uncover the astonishing details. William's fury over royal leak. An insult aimed at Prince George might have seemed like the kind of royal controversy that would dominate headlines for a few days before quietly fading away. The cameras would move on, the public would find a new story, and the palace would return to business as usual. But behind the grand walls and polished corridors, something far more troubling was beginning to emerge. What unsettled Prince William was not simply the confrontation involving Camilla's son. It was the growing suspicion that someone had been feeding information from inside the royal system. Private details appeared to be reaching people who should never have had access to them. Restricted events, internal reviews, and confidential discussions were no longer staying behind closed doors. As reports continued to surface, William realized the issue stretched beyond a family disagreement. Hidden beneath the public drama was a much larger question: who inside the palace could be trusted? The answer seemed to be buried within an event held at the Royal Horticultural Hall. Security footage from that gathering revealed details that immediately raised alarms. Certain names had appeared where they should not have appeared. Access had been granted through channels that left experienced officials struggling to explain how it had happened. By the late afternoon, at precisely 6 minutes past 5, William stepped into a private meeting room deep within the palace. 5 senior aides were already waiting. There were no greetings, no small talk, and no attempt to soften the atmosphere. The future heir to the throne carried only one objective into that room: uncover the truth. He placed his phone on the table and replayed the footage. Every second was watched in complete silence. When the recording ended, the room felt heavier than before. William's attention turned directly toward the security team. The explanations that followed focused on procedures, verification systems, and emergency approvals. Yet William showed little interest in hearing how the system was designed to function. He wanted to know how it had actually been used. Earlier, he had spoken with King Charles. The conversation was brief but significant. After hearing the evidence and the concerns surrounding the leak, the king permitted William to take control of the investigation. That approval changed everything. Now the search no longer centered on Camilla's son. It was leading somewhere far more dangerous, straight toward someone working within the palace itself. William finally received the answer he had been searching for, but it raised far more questions than it resolved. How did a series of seemingly minor decisions inside Buckingham Palace evolve into a troubling pattern? And why did the growing controversy surrounding Camilla's son capture William's attention more than anything else? Stay tuned as the mystery behind the palace walls begins to unravel. William's disturbing palace discovery. Finally, the answer William had been searching for arrived, and it was far more troubling than anyone inside the palace expected. For weeks, strange patterns had surfaced behind the grand walls of Buckingham Palace. Small decisions that seemed harmless on their own began forming a picture that William could no longer ignore. Access permissions changed unexpectedly. Sensitive discussions appeared to reach the wrong ears, and certain individuals seemed able to move around restrictions that applied to everyone else. What caught William's attention most was the growing controversy surrounding Camilla's son. His unexpected appearance at a restricted royal gathering raised immediate questions. The rules had been clear, and those responsible for guest approvals knew exactly what those rules were. Yet somehow, the barriers had vanished. When William confronted a palace aide, the explanation changed everything. The restrictions had not been forgotten. They had not been misunderstood. They had been deliberately overlooked after pressure came from someone higher up the chain. The room fell silent. Suddenly, this was no longer about one guest crossing a line. It was about discovering who possessed enough influence to bend palace procedures without consequence. Determined to uncover the truth, William ordered confidential records to be reviewed. Names were examined, connections were traced, and relationships were mapped carefully. As the investigation expanded, attention shifted from a single incident to a network of people whose loyalties appeared increasingly complicated. Then, a discovery emerged. A palace manager held family ties to an aide connected to Camilla's circle. The connection alone proved nothing. Yet William believed the timing was impossible to ignore. Over the previous 2 months, he had become concerned that personal relationships were quietly influencing official responsibilities. What once seemed like harmless friendships now appeared linked to decisions involving estate access, internal operations, and privileged information. The response was swift. Without lengthy discussions or delays, William ordered the manager's access privileges suspended, pending further clarification. Within minutes, security escorted the individual from the property through a rear gate. News spread rapidly across the royal household, sending a message that echoed through every corridor. Meanwhile, Prince George sat silently in a departing car, his thoughts fixed on recent events. As William continued following every lead, a more unsettling question remained unanswered. If someone had the power to bypass palace restrictions, who else might have had the power to pass along secrets that were never meant to leave the palace walls? Camilla's son spoke with remarkable confidence, revealing details that seemed far beyond his reach. But how did he gain access to information guarded by the palace's most trusted insiders? And why did his words leave Prince George questioning far more than a simple public challenge? What happened next would only deepen the mystery. George stunned by palace secret. There was one detail Camilla's son seemed to have overlooked when he stepped forward before the crowd and spoke with striking confidence. The information he shared was not supposed to exist beyond a tiny circle of trusted royal insiders. Yet there he stood, speaking as though he had personally read documents locked deep within palace walls. For Prince George, that realization was far more disturbing than the public challenge itself. As the event drew to a close, conversations continued around the hall, but Prince George's attention had already shifted elsewhere. The words he had just heard refused to leave his mind. It was not the criticism, the raised voices, or even the uncomfortable scene unfolding in front of guests. It was the knowledge behind the remarks. References to a confidential financial review, sensitive discussions about estate management, and private meetings involving senior members of the royal family should never have reached the public. During the journey back to Buckingham Palace, Prince George remained unusually quiet. While others expected an immediate response, he chose silence. He spent the drive replaying every moment, searching for details that had seemed insignificant at first but now felt impossible to ignore. When he finally requested the list of attendees, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Several journalists present were known for their close connections to Camilla's family. A photographer had been positioned in exactly the right place, equipped to capture every second of the confrontation. More curious still was the discovery that Camilla's son had been added to the guest list at the very last moment. Separately, each detail could have meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture that felt far too deliberate. The deeper Prince George looked, the more questions surfaced. How had information from an internal review reached someone outside the palace? Who had access to those files? More importantly, who had decided to share them? The audit had been restricted to only a handful of senior figures, making the leak even more alarming. Before reaching Buckingham Palace, Prince George quietly reached out to a trusted contact with an intelligence background. His instructions were precise. He wanted every communication connected to the confidential review examined, including encrypted messages that may have slipped beyond authorized channels. By the time the palace gates appeared ahead, one thing had become clear. This was no longer about an awkward public clash. It was about uncovering the hidden hand that had turned a royal secret into a carefully staged spectacle. Buckingham Palace had finally fallen silent, yet behind closed doors, a very different story was unfolding. As Prince George and William followed separate trails through a growing controversy, what began as a single troubling incident started exposing something far deeper. Were they chasing the same mystery or uncovering secrets capable of shaking the monarchy itself? Let's find out. William and George hunt truth. By the time the palace corridors had grown quiet and most of Buckingham Palace had settled into the stillness of the night, lights continued to glow behind closed office doors. Prince George was not ready to leave, and neither was William. Though both were pursuing the same mystery, they were following very different paths. One searched for the people behind the growing controversy surrounding Camilla's son, while the other searched for something far less visible, the hidden movement of information. What had first appeared to be a single uncomfortable incident was beginning to reveal deeper layers. As files, approvals, personnel records, and access changes were reviewed, scattered details started fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. A familiar name surfaced, followed by another connection tied to sensitive positions within royal operations. None of the discoveries seemed alarming on their own, yet together they painted a picture that was difficult to ignore. The closer Prince George looked, the more he noticed personal relationships drifting toward areas that held valuable royal knowledge and protected assets. At the same time, a completely different discovery landed on William's desk. Unlike previous reports, this one was not centered on staff, invitations, or leaked conversations. It focused on money. The figures showed patterns of financial activity that immediately captured his attention. Suddenly, what had looked like a series of unrelated problems no longer seemed so simple. The investigation was no longer asking who gained access, it was asking who benefited. Then, another detail emerged. Records revealed a series of encrypted communications between Camilla and a prominent legal firm in the city. Seeking legal advice was hardly unusual, but the timing raised difficult questions. The contacts had reportedly taken place while a confidential financial review was quietly underway. William studied the report in silence. Coincidences had become increasingly difficult to dismiss. A troubling possibility began to take shape. If knowledge of the review had reached Camilla's circle before its completion, had preparations already been made to protect certain interests? Had important decisions been quietly unfolding behind palace walls while everyone focused on the public drama surrounding Camilla's son? Determined to find answers, William immediately turned to his legal advisors. Yet the response he received offered little comfort. If significant financial concerns were uncovered, preventing the movement of funds would be far more difficult than expected. For the first time, the investigation seemed to be leading toward a destination far larger than anyone inside the palace had imagined. What began as a brief confrontation seemed destined to fade away, yet the consequences only grew larger with time. But what hidden details buried within legal papers and estate records caught Prince William's attention, and why did a 2-minute encounter trigger concerns that reached far beyond the palace walls? Let's unravel the details. William investigates shocking estate secrets. The message arrived long before any official announcement was made. Hidden among legal papers, estate records, and financial documents was a growing trail that caught Prince William's attention. What had seemed like a brief and heated exchange involving Camilla's son at the Royal Horticultural Hall was no longer being viewed as an isolated incident. The encounter had lasted less than 2 minutes, yet its impact was spreading through palace corridors faster than anyone expected. William understood that accusations alone could achieve nothing. Several funds connected to the estates were protected within complicated trust arrangements that stood beyond direct palace authority. Without clear legal justification, no action could be taken. Rather than challenge that reality, he changed direction. If the money itself could not yet be reached, then every path surrounding it would be examined. He requested a far wider review, one that stretched beyond simple accounts and into land ownership records, estate rights, obligations, liabilities, and any transaction that appeared unusual. As investigators dug deeper, new questions emerged. The issue was no longer centered on the behavior of Camilla's son during a public event. Attention shifted toward something far more sensitive. How much access had certain individuals gained behind palace walls, and where should the limits of that influence be drawn? The deeper the review went, the more William became convinced that the matter touched the very structure of royal operations. At the palace, silence suddenly became policy. William ordered 48 hours of absolute control. No leaks, no discussions with reporters, no public reactions. Conversations were restricted to closed-door meetings, and staff were warned that any breach of confidentiality could bring immediate consequences. The atmosphere changed overnight. Outwardly, everything appeared calm. Privately, important decisions were taking shape. When William met King Charles again, he spoke less about individuals and more about principles. Documents were placed before the king, outlining concerns over access, influence, and the handling of sensitive information. After a long pause, Charles agreed in principle to temporary measures restricting certain privileges until the review was completed. Elsewhere, the consequences were already unfolding. In a quiet room surrounded by half-packed boxes, Camilla's son stared at a phone screen glowing with fresh notifications. A relative entered, carrying troubling news from the bank. For the first time since that confrontation at the Royal Horticultural Hall, the possibility became impossible to ignore. Those brief moments in the spotlight may have triggered consequences far greater than anyone had imagined. Camilla's son seemed certain that a public confrontation with Prince George would force the palace into a corner. But what made him take such a bold risk, and why did events behind closed doors soon transform confidence into a crisis no one expected? Let's uncover the intriguing details. William's response shocks Camilla's son. Just hours after standing before Prince George at a crowded charity gathering, Camilla's son believed he had finally forced difficult questions into the open. Surrounded by cameras, onlookers, and growing public attention, he appeared confident that the palace would have no choice but to respond. Yet while the headlines focused on that brief and uncomfortable exchange, something far more serious was unfolding far from public view. By the time the weekend arrived, the atmosphere had changed completely. Inside, a quiet room filled with scattered documents and half-packed boxes, his phone flashed endlessly with alerts. Across social media, millions of reactions poured in as people debated every second of the confrontation. The criticism was fierce, but public opinion was no longer his greatest concern. A message arrived that stopped him cold. Financial institutions were requesting records to explain several transactions exceeding $5,000. There were no accusations, no dramatic allegations, only formal requests for clarification. Yet the meaning was impossible to ignore. Attention had shifted from public controversy to personal affairs. Then came another blow. Access to estate management offices would soon end. Long-standing privileges, trusted contacts, and familiar support networks seemed to be disappearing one after another. Doors that once opened with a simple phone call were suddenly closed. His greatest concern was Camilla's silence. He expected support, a private intervention, or at least some reassurance, but none came. Then a sealed letter from her legal team arrived, banning interviews and public comments while warning that certain transactions were under review. Suddenly, the silence made sense, and the situation appeared far more serious than anyone had imagined. While Camilla's son struggled to understand the pieces falling around him, another development was taking shape behind palace walls. During the next 48 hours, a document was quietly finalized. Then, on a Monday morning at Buckingham Palace, King Charles sat waiting as Prince William entered carrying a folder. No reporters were present. No cameras recorded the moment. Yet the decision placed on that table had the power to permanently reshape the relationship between Camilla's family and the royal establishment, and few outside that room even knew it was happening. Could Camilla's silence have revealed more than any public confrontation ever could? After accepting a royal decree without changing a single term, why did she choose calm over resistance? And how did a dispute involving her son and Prince George grow into a crisis far larger than anyone expected? Let's find out. Camilla accepts shocking royal decree. Silence settled over the palace in a way that felt far more unsettling than any argument. Hours earlier, a formal decree had been delivered to Camilla's residence, carrying a decision that many believed would trigger an immediate confrontation. Instead, nothing happened. No urgent calls arrived. No legal representatives appeared. No requests for meetings were made. The only confirmation that came back was that Camilla had received the document and accepted it without changing a single term. That unexpected calm followed days of growing concern inside royal circles. What first appeared to be a simple disagreement involving Camilla's son and Prince George had evolved into something far larger. Questions emerged about guest lists, private arrangements, and how certain names had found their way into positions they were never meant to occupy. As investigators examined drafts, invitations, and internal records, attention shifted away from one isolated incident and toward the system that had allowed confusion to develop in the first place. Prince George's concerns reportedly led to a wider review, while William pushed for answers that went beyond appearances. The deeper officials looked, the more they discovered. Revised plans, altered placements, and unexpected connections raised fresh questions about who had authority to make decisions involving the future generation of the monarchy. Even Prince George's role became central to discussions about protecting royal protocol. By the time the findings reached King Charles, the matter was no longer viewed as a family disagreement. It had become a question of boundaries. William placed a document before the king, recommending that several privileges and forms of access connected to Camilla's family be reduced or removed. After reviewing the reports and the events that had unfolded since a Tuesday afternoon gathering, Charles signed. Yet the signature was not what lingered in people's minds. It was Camilla's reaction, or lack of one. William had secured the outcome he wanted, but her silence left a mystery hanging over the palace. Was it acceptance, defeat, or simply patience? In a world where every move is carefully measured, saying nothing at all can sometimes be the most powerful move of all. Now, what do you think really happened behind the scenes after Camilla's son allegedly humiliated Prince George, triggering William's explosive reaction? We'd like to hear your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe.